Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, there's also instances that combine both the motifs that we just looked at. Here, for example, is white to play, and he has several good moves, but what is the strongest one? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video now. What's clear is that a general exchange is called for so that white can go into the winning endgame with his pawn majority here on the queen side. The problem after bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, rook takes f6, king takes f6, b4 is that after king e5 black is able to draw. The correct move therefore is rook takes f6, and after rook takes f6 playing b4 or even a6 would also win. The point is that black must now lose a tempo by moving his king. So for example, king f7, now bishop takes f6, king takes f6, b5, and white wins. As before, this was a tempo winning combination, and the partially pinned bishop was replaced by a completely pinned rook. Okay, so that's everything regarding the pinned piece itself. So now we'll move on to the issue of unpinning. So unpinning can of course occur at any stage of the game. So first of all, we'll consider the opening. Nimzowitsch gave the Italian game as an example. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d3, d6, all standard stuff. And now let's say white plays bishop g5. This move gives black a lot of possibilities. He can challenge it right away with h6, or he can play bishop e6, which is a dynamic choice, accepting the double pawns for open f-file and more pawns in the center. Thirdly, he can choose to ignore the threat of knight d5 and centralize himself with knight d4, or he can play knight a5, attacking the bishop, or he can just castle. Now, the most important elements of unpinning are something that we definitely have to consider. There's one more possibility here. After h6, bishop h4, g5. I should have just taken that a bit further. Something he can do with h6. So, other ways to challenge a pin with pawns is one of the examples we looked at there. So we'll go into that in a little bit more depth. So, obviously it's not a good idea to advance pawns too willingly. For example, in the Scotch opening, as follows. It's not a line that you see much nowadays, but it used to be one of the most popular. So, this is a pin here, and let's say that black now elects to challenge the pin with h6, and after bishop h4, g5, bishop g3. This advance has of course badly weakened his king side. White will be able to continue with f4 at the right moment, as well as planting pieces in f5 and h5 that can never be challenged with pawns. Therefore, challenging in this instance was not correct. However, there are times when it is correct. For example, in one of Nimzowicz's own games, which went as follows. Nimzowitsch has got black here, and also, yeah, I should mention after e takes d4, black is giving up the center, as Nimzowitsch has chose to do here, but he has a strong idea in mind. After the game continued like this, rook e8, he wants to put pressure on e4 because he's created a bind on his opponent, advancing it to e5. So Cohn played bishop g5, creating the same pin as we just saw. And so here it is correct to challenge it directly, h6 and bishop h4. If instead bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, then black is going to have a good time on the dark squares and gain a good, easy game. So bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and now knight takes e4. And you know, his opponent, who was called Con, must have assumed that he would be able to exploit these weakening moves as compensation for the pawn, but he was wrong. After knight takes e4, rook takes e4, knight b3, attacking the bishop. Well, it's defended, but obviously black wants to keep it. Bishop d3, attacking the rook, and now bishop g4, attacking the queen. It's a nice intermezzo before moving the rook, because the f pawn is pinned thanks to the bishop. So queen d2, now rook e8, and here Nimzowitsch just followed up with knight c6 and queen f6, and he won with ease. So we've looked at two examples where challenging was correct and incorrect. In both cases, black weakens his position considerably, and of course this should not be done unless there is compensation of some kind. In this case, black won a pawn, and it's often the case that the bishop in question, which is being forced back, will end up on a square that it doesn't necessarily want to be placed on. However, this is not always the case, and it's another thing that we have to consider in such situations, especially if the center is opened up. For example, here's another game. So it's the 4 knights, and bishop g5 to challenge the knight, because if g4 is played right away, white's getting into trouble. After knight takes g4, h takes g4, bishop takes g4, retaining the pin, and with f5 coming next. So in order to deal with the pin in the best possible way, bishop g5 is the move that should be played now. So queen d6, now bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, g4, bishop g6. And you know, despite these weakening king moves, the bishop on g6 is doing absolutely nothing here. It's biting on granite, so to speak, just with a protected pawn as its target. And so it's a badly posted piece, and the g4 push is more justified. It's important to note that if black still had a d pawn here, because white exchanged, if there was still a d pawn, and then the position might not be so bad, because he can challenge the e4 pawn with pushing his d pawn to d5. And now the bishop, then the bishop would become more active. Black does have the options of f6 and bishop f7, but this takes time. And in any case, white need not worry here, because his solid center means that the loose king side is not a problem. On the contrary, he can follow up with knight f5 at the right moment, obviously when the queen is moved away from attacking h4, and then he can create some attacking chances on the king side. Okay, so now we'll take a look at example when the challenge bishop becomes strong. This is the example that Nimzowitsch gave, the Italian game again, and h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3. And you know, the question now is whether the bishop on g3 can be transformed into a good piece. And in order for that to be the case, white would have to try and challenge the black center. He can do that in various ways. For example, by playing bishop b5, taking on c6, and then playing d4, or by knight d5 and c3 and d4. So let's say black plays a6 to take away the first possibility. Now would come knight d5. Let's say, for example, bishop e6, c3, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, knight e7, now d4, e takes d4, Knight takes d4. White is giving up a pawn after knight e takes d5, but he has excellent compensation after castling because his bishop has sprung to life and he's able to play knight f5, rook e1, and everything is working very nicely. Instead of a6 at this stage, black can play bishop g4 in order to restrain white in the center. He could now play h4, and you know, this kind of move is always effective when our opponent has advanced on the flank, which we can undermine his pawns and the squares he's controlling here. So knight h5 was the move that was played in the game, and it's a move that Nimzowitsch criticized because it removes central control. He preferred instead rook g8 or even bishop d7. So knight h5, h takes g5, another move that Nimzowitsch criticized despite its being the logical continuation of the pawn advance. The move he thought undoubtedly best was knight d5 here, because after knight h5, white has more pieces and pawns in the center, and he should try and utilize that immediately by getting a knight to the center. So h takes g5, now knight d4. Yet another move that Nimzowitsch criticized, giving knight takes g3 instead, f takes g3, and only now knight d4, and black is doing well. For example, if rook takes h6, rook takes h6, g takes h6, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen g5 with a good edge. There's other possibilities as well. For example, instead of rook takes h6, knight d5, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen takes g5, g4, c6, rook h5, and now a very nice move, c takes d5, rook takes g5, h takes g5, and black has a winning position here. So Nimzowitsch closes this chapter by stressing the importance of understanding how the challenges to the pins that we saw in these examples, although taking place on the flank, actually represent an issue in the center of the board. Okay, so now we'll look at the other options that the pinned player has. Sorry, I said chapter there, I meant section. In some cases, a player can simply ignore the threat or allow his pawn structure to be damaged. This can be done when there is freedom for action in the center in order to counter any subsequent central attack that our opponent is intending. It should not be considered as an option if we already have a passive defensive setup, i.e. there must be a guarantee of activity, or we will be faced with a long torture session. The example Nimzowitsch gives goes as follows. The same opening again, and now bishop g5, with the same idea of playing knight d5 to exploit the pin and the fact that the bishop on c5 is unable to assist in breaking it. So let's say black just ignores the threat and simply castles. So now knight d5, black can continue with bishop e6, and his king side is broken up when knight takes f6, g takes f6, bishop h6, and rook e8. So let's say white continues with knight h4, is threatening bishop takes e6 and queen g4 and mate. So black can answer calmly with king h8, and here white has a small edge but nothing huge, and the reason for this is because black is able to play d5 and advance in the center, and as I'm sure all of you know, there is no better way to break up a flank attack than by attacking in the center. This is a very useful thing to bear in mind. It's come to my own assistance many times when I'm faced with a flank attack. If your center is mobile, or if you can create some kind of push or piece play, you know, the point is generally your opponent cannot afford to let you take over the center of the board, unless of course he has a completely winning flank attack, in which case you may as well resign. but 95% of the time this is not the case, and the strength and threats created with a central push absolutely have to be taken seriously, or it will be the flank attacker who ends up getting crushed instead. Here White has allowed some pieces to become committed on the king side, and as a result they have lost contact with the center. Nimzowitsch points out that if White could somehow gain control of the f5 square here, he might be better, but this is very unlikely, and Black would have to allow it. The situation is much the same if White exchanges with his bishop instead of his knight on f6 at move 8. So this is another approach to consider when we're faced with such a pin. Another option is bringing up reserve troops to help fix any problems associated with the pin. Nimzowitsch recommended that approach, bringing up the reserve troops, to all those who like a peaceful life. The example he used is from the Met-Get defense in the 4 knights as follows: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, bishop b4, castles, castles, d3, d6, bishop g5, creating the pin. And now Mecca's move was bishop takes c3, removing the possibility of knight d5, and after b takes c3, playing queen e7. And the idea is to play knight d8 to e6 in order to attack the bishop on g5, and should it go to h4, continuing with the knight on e6, going to f4 and g6 to attack the bishop on h4, and if he plays bishop g5, then playing h6. Of course, such long maneuvers as these can only be considered when a central position is stable and fixed. Another example along similar lines goes in an old line of the Petrov defense. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, d4, bishop e7, bishop d3, knight f6. Nowadays the move is d5 there, castles and bishop g4, creating the pin. And the great player Tarrasch used to solve this pin with a long-winded maneuver rook e1, and then knight d2 to f1 to g3 and h3. And the point of bringing the knight to g3 is that bishop h5 won't be possible. And you know, the reasoning behind this was that the unpinning must take place as quickly as possible, and the fact that the maneuver used by bringing the rook to the e-file and the knight to g3 and playing h3, all of those moves are useful anyway. So there's no kind of drawback. You know, you're not playing passive defensive moves. They're all moves that you would probably be playing even if the pin wasn't there. So that's another approach, simply just bringing up reserve troops and attacking with a pawn or challenging with pieces. Okay, so that just about sums up this chapter. As I said at the beginning, it's fairly simple stuff, so I won't go through any of the sample games involving pins in the book. But you know, in any case, it never hurts to have a little refresher regarding the basic stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck with creating some decisive pins. Cheers.